Hello there. Good day, everyone. This is J.D. Seal, and I'm the Vice President at Skyview Partners. And I want to welcome you today to our session on security considerations for your save, restore operations on the IBM I, presented by Carol Woodbury. Today's session is sponsored by Skyview Partners. We're happy to have you to this educational series, Coffee with Carol. We hope you enjoy it. Again, if you have questions during the session, please type them into the question box. We'd love to have this to be as interactive as possible. At Skyview Partners, we're committed to delivering products and services that not only provide our customers with sound advice, but also saves them time and reduces the cost and complexities of security administration, including compliance. Today's presenter is Carol Woodbury, President and CTO of Skyview Partners. Prior to forming Skyview, nearly 10 years ago, it'll be 10 years next month, Carol spent 16+ years at IBM in positions including Chief Engineering Manager and Security Architect for IBM's I-Series Security Group, and is also the author of the book IBM I and I5OS Security and Compliance, A Practical Guide. On the commercial side, Skyview products available all include the Skyview Risk Assessor diagnostic tool, very powerful tool for those that need independent vulnerability review, which virtually everyone does. Skyview Policy Minder, an automated security administration tool to allow you to compare your planned security configuration to what the current security configuration is. Skyview Audit Journal Reporter, predefined auditor-ready reports on the security events recorded in the System Audit Journal, and Skyview Policy Minder for IBM AIX. We also provide various services, including a security checkup, which is the use of the Risk Assessor software with a review one-on-one with Skyview security experts, and we have a special security checkup for customers with J.D. Edwards. We also do various re-architecture and remediation services, and are now announcing the Skyview Managed Security Services to let Skyview monitor your security configuration for non-compliant events. So with that, I want to turn the session over to Carol for today's presentation on security considerations for your save restore operations on IBM I. Carol?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. There we go. JD, can you see my screen?
I can. You're good to go.
All right. I had received a couple questions via email last month about some things with saving and restoring various objects, and when things are saved and when things are restored, and so I thought that maybe it might be a good topic for a more general audience, and that's how I came up with the topic for today. So we'll be going through a number of things. The agenda for today are things like how the security attributes of objects are saved and then restored. We'll be talking about saving and restoring user profiles, saving and restoring authorization lists, as well as some encryption considerations. Not necessarily all in this order, so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing, and probably the easiest thing to think about and be aware of, are the save and restore considerations for user profiles. So when you go to save a user profile, there's no save user profile command. It's actually called save sec data, so save security data. And when you save your security data, that is, you save all of the user profiles on the system. You also save the authorization list, and you save private authorities. You also get these things called authority holders, and those are really kind of a holdover. They're almost an authorization list, but not quite, and they're really a holdover from the old 36 environment days. Not too many people use them anymore, but they're still there. And then you get this stuff called function usage information, and that is when you go into application administration, which is a tool through I-Series Navigator, and you set settings like which pieces of I-Series Navigator end users can see, or the setting that allows people with job control to see the job log of an all-object user. That type of configuration information is called function usage information. It's associated with a user, but not part of the user profile. But since it's associated with the user, it is saved with the user profiles. And then lastly, there's these things called server authentication entries. And those entries are typically used, or one of the ways that they're used is on a DDM connection. And it's a way for you to run DDM over and require a password on the connection. It's also a way to say that the connection starts as one user and then makes the connection on the target system as a different user, so server authentication entries. So all these things are saved when you do a save security data. Another note is that if you do a save sys, a save sec data is also done at that same time. Okay, so the other thing that is kind of the counterpart to this is the information that is stored with an object. So, and there's kind of 3 or 4 slides that once we put these all together, you'll get the right picture that I'm trying to paint. So the other thing that we need to talk through is what information, what security information is stored with each object. And when you think of securing a specific object, and most people think of or saving a file or a data area or that type of thing, what is stored with that in the header of each I5OS object type is the owner of that object, along with the owner's authority, which typically defaults to all, but some people modify the owner's authority. This thing called a primary group, so each object can have a group profile assigned to it, and that group profile is also stored with the object. The name of the authorization list, if the object is secured by an authorization list, and the object auditing values. So these things are stored with the object, and therefore these things are saved with the object and therefore come with the object when it is subsequently restored. Now let's go back to thinking about user profiles. There's a user profile object, and you would most likely think of this user profile object as containing things like the user profile attributes. So the initial program, the initial menu, the special authorities that the user has, and that type of configuration information about the user profile. And that's true, but there's this also another piece to every user profile object that contains some additional information. And there is an entry for every object that that profile owns. And there's also an entry for every object to which the profile has been granted a private authority. And there's an entry for every object that this profile owns that other profiles have a private authority to. And there's an an entry for every object that this profile is the primary group for. So if I back up one slide and I point out the fact that with the object, when the object is saved, you get the owner and you get the primary group, and oh, I'm missing one, the public authority. Okay, there's a big one that I'm missing, so I'll have to add that before the slides go out. The public authority is also stored with the object. Okay, but missing from that picture from an authority security point of view is the private authorities associated with that object, and that's why I have highlighted this in red, because the private authorities are not stored with the object, they're actually stored with the user profile. And that's why, if we back up a few slides even more, when you do the save sec data, That's why private authorities are saved. So by default, they are not saved with the object. They are saved when a user profile is saved. So let's go through this a little bit more. Okay, so we have the object information, including public authority, and we have the user profile entries. Okay, so when you save, we've looked through what happens when you save the user profiles. What happens when you restore all profiles, and it has to be all profiles, you get all of the user profiles, of course, and you get the authorization list at that point. Now, you can individually restore an individual user profile, but you can't individually restore authorization lists. So when you want to restore your authorization lists, you must be restoring all of your user profiles. Okay, and along with that, so you get the user profiles, you get the authorization lists. When you restore either an individual user profile or all user profiles, you get this object that enables you to grant back those private authorities. They don't automatically get granted back. You have to take one more step. So when you restore user profiles, you also get those authority holders, that function usage information, as well as the server authentication entries. So the way that you get those private authorities back is when you run that restore user profile star all, you need to run a restore auth, and that's what goes around and grants back those private authorities. So if you've ever restored user profiles and not run restore auth, what you will sometimes see is when you go in and do a display user profile of a user profile, you may see the error message or the informational message that says private authorities not restored. So the thing is that there's still this object out there containing these private authorities that want to be granted back. There's a couple reasons why that object may remain out there. So let me go through this order. When you are restoring anything to the system, and especially for disaster recovery, the proper order to restore things in is that you restore all of your user profiles to the system, then you restore your objects, and then you run the restore auth. And one of the reasons that you want to do it in this way, you want to restore the objects after you restore the user profiles, is so that when you restore your objects, the owners of those objects being restored are already in the system, and things don't end up being owned by QDefault own. Okay. The other reason you want to do it in this way is so that when you run the restore auth, then the objects that need the private authorities will be on the system, and the restore auth will be able to grant all those private authorities across. Now, there's a couple reasons why that restore the restore authority object may remain on the system. First of all, if you do this in the wrong order, if you do the restore auth before you restore your objects, the objects aren't there, and so there's nothing to grant the private authority to. So you have to do it in the right order. If you don't run this command at all, it's going to remain out there. The other thing is that even when you run the restore auth command, if not all of the objects are on the system that were on the system where the save was performed, then there may still be some extraneous private authorities that this object wants to grant to. A good example of that is objects in the IFS. So if you have had a private authority at a directory and you create an object into a directory and it inherits the private authorities down from the directory, and then you just get many, many objects inheriting that private authority, you may not have restored those IFS objects, and that might have been on purpose, especially if it's something like a log file, something that you might not need perpetually. But the private authorities, they're still basically, think of it as a record of that private authority, and it still needs to be granted back, or the system thinks it needs to be granted back. And so that's why that object remains out there, and that's how you still see that object sitting out there and still see that message when you do a display user profile. Okay, enough about that. I often get asked, well, how often should I save my user profiles? And that's one of those it depends questions. So the thing that you need to think through is, how often are user profiles created in your organization? If you're a large organization and you have many users coming and going, I would want to be doing a save sec data nightly so that I wouldn't have to try to figure out which users have been created and which users need to be deleted if I somehow lost my system. So how often are profiles created? How often are authorities granted and revoked? And the other thing you need to think through is, basically, do you have the documentation to back up the requests that have been made throughout the day to either create a user profile, change a user profile, delete a user profile, or grant or revoke some sort of authority? So if you have a very rigorous process that documents all of those activities, then maybe back through that documentation and just reapply everything. Waste your time, but at least you do it. If you don't have that data, so that if you had to recover your system, you would not have to try to reproduce all of those requests by memory. You would have other things to think about at that point in time. I've also gotten questions about the performance of save sec data. So the other thing that you can do, and so save sec data, of course, we talked through all the things that it's saving. So if you want to shrink the time that you are using for your saving of your security data, there's a couple things you can do. One of them is to get rid of unused profiles. And if you have heard me speak on any other topic, especially on the topic of compliance, you know that one of my biggest pet peeves is to have unused profiles and unused objects on the system. So if you get rid of those unused profiles, that will help the performance of your save sec data. The other thing that you want to endeavor to get rid of, and this is certainly something that will definitely improve the speed of your save sec data, is to get rid of private authorities. So some people take the approach of granting, say, the user Bill, the private authority to every file in a library. Well, instead of taking that approach, I would recommend that you secure those files with an authorization list and grant Bill authority to the authorization list. That would constitute one private authority, and so one entry in that user profile, rather than an entry for each one of those files. So again, that would certainly reduce the length of your save sec data to get rid of those extraneous private authorities. I'm not saying to open your objects up and change your security scheme, but what I'm saying is to use an alternate scheme to try to reduce the number of private authorities on your system. Okay, so aside from users and aside from those private authorities, there's the security information that's stored with the object. And these are the commands that obviously save individual objects. And then there's obviously the corresponding restore commands. So the information, again, that is saved and restored with this is the owner and the owner's authority, primary group and primary group authority, name of the authorization list, and object auditing value, and of course the one I forgot, at least I consistently forgot, is the private authority. Okay, that's also saved and restored with the object itself. Now, the interesting thing is that starting in V6R1, with those individual save commands, you now have the opportunity to save the private authorities with the object itself. Now, that's not the default, but you do get that opportunity. So this is an opportunity for things like the situation where one of my clients ran into, they were trying to refresh one of their production libraries, and they had granted a number of private authorities to a specific file. That got overlaid, that file got overlaid, and basically it was a delete and replace, and therefore all those private authorities went away. What they could have done was to have done a save object with and taken the option to save the private authorities, and then when that file got re-restored, they can take the option on the restore to restore the private authorities as well. Now this does cause the save of these objects to go longer. So if you are tempted to change the command default to always save the private authorities with the object, you may want to look at the performance of that before you do that. You could have performance implications on your saves, but this is an option, and it does provide some flexibility that you might not have had otherwise. So of course, when you go to restore the private authorities, this is kind of one of those duh moments, but if you go to restore an object, you must have first saved the private authorities on the save side. Otherwise, you can't restore them when you go to restore the object. So just a little note there that you would have had to have taken a conscious effort to have saved those private authorities. They will not, by default, get saved with the object. You have to make sure that you could do that on the save before you can take advantage of the save private authorities or restore private authorities on the restore commands. Okay, so I alluded to this a little bit earlier for the ownership of objects, but there are some things to consider when you are restoring objects to a system when it comes to ownership of objects. So if the object doesn't exist on the system already, and you are restoring a new object to the system, and the object on your media or in your save file is owned by a profile that doesn't currently exist on the system, what happens is that it ends up, after the restore, being owned by QDefault own. Now, when you have objects that are owned by QDefault own, that really should be an indication to you that there's some not normal condition. Now, objects really shouldn't be owned by QDefault own. That's really there. IBM put that profile there as more of a placeholder to allow objects like this that to come onto the system, but really it's not really meant to sit and perpetually own a bunch of objects. It's there to facilitate restoration and that type of thing, but you want to really kind of straighten that out. The other consideration with ownership is that when the object already exists on the system and you're restoring a new copy of it and the owners don't match, the owner of the object that is currently on the system is the one that will prevail, if you will. So when you go to restore the object, if you just do a straight restore without doing any other of the extra parameters, the restore will actually fail because the owners don't match. So that's when you have to take the option to specify the allow object differences star all or star owner or compatible. And even when you do that, once the object is restored, it will remain owned by the profile that was on the system originally. So the media one sort of loses out. So that's just a little bit of clarification on the ownership. Now another consideration when you're looking at saving and restoring objects is what saves the special authority brings to the table. So the purpose of this special authority is really meant so that you can have an operator that can save your system or restore objects without having to have authority to those objects. Think of it as the operator role, and that's what enables the operator role to function properly without having to have all object. So that's really the purpose of SaveSys. Now, when the system was first released, the programmer class, when you create a user profile, and if you put a user profile in the programmer class, it used to default so that the programmer would have both job control and SaveSys special authority. And so I believe that that's how a lot of programmers end up with SaveSys special authority. The problem today is that that really is not necessary for the vast majority of programmers to have. Really, the only people that should be having SaveSys are really those people tasked with saving or restoring your system or restoring individual objects, and that's typically operators and administrators. So when you go to review your special authorities, take a look at the SaveSys, and it's highly likely that you can remove that. Now, I think that some people are hesitant to remove SaveSys from profiles because they think that they won't be able to do something with their own objects, save and restore their own objects. But as long as you have object existence, which is included in all authority, which if you own an object, you have all authority, as long as you have sufficient authority to the object, and especially the ones you own, you can save and restore those yourself. So if you're thinking of a programmer and in a development environment, they'll be able to do whatever they need to do as long as they own their own objects, which is typically the setup in a development environment. So removing SaveSys, especially from programmers, is typically not going to break what they need to do for their own work, and it won't enable them to be able to do anything beyond what their role has them doing. Okay, last but certainly not least, there are some things that you should think about when you look at your backup when they relate to encryption. And the fact of the matter is there are a number of laws and regulations that either require or highly recommend that the data be encrypted. And that would include not just when it's on the system, but also when it's backed up on media. The other thing to consider is that a lot of the state breach notification laws that are out there exempt you from having to notify the people whose data was lost if the data was encrypted. So if you go out and look at the websites that list all the different breaches, it will say what the type of breach was, and a lot of those breaches are due to lost media. So all of the organizations that lost that media had to notify the people that whose data was lost unless the media was encrypted. So for example, probably 5 years ago now, I received a letter from IBM, being a former IBMer, because they lost a tape and it wasn't encrypted, and it had my salary data and personal data on it, along with however many former IBMers' data on it. So if they had encrypted that tape, they would not have had to notify me. So that in and of itself may be cost justification for investing your time and perhaps some hardware cost into doing encrypted backups. So there are some challenges, of course, when you go to encrypt your backup. It does require either specialized hardware or software, okay? And that definitely has some disaster recovery implications if you think through that all the way through the line and throughout your processes for IT. You can't forget DR. One of the things you have to be able to manage is that encryption key. So if you bring back that media that is encrypted, you have to make sure that you have the right encryption key to be able to decrypt that data. So There may be obvious reasons that you want to do encrypted backup, but you definitely want to think through that process before you go down that road. So this is a slide that was provided to me by Deb Sagan, a good friend from IBM, that lists the various options for encrypting data on the IBM I. And so I'm not going to talk through this. She is definitely more the expert on this topic than I am, but I just wanted to raise the awareness of the various options that you have for encrypting data on the IBM I so that you can consider that for encrypting your data both at rest and when it goes on to that saved media. All right. So if we have any questions, I'm going to start looking at the question box. I think we might have a poll in the middle. I'm now tweeting, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, here's my handle for that, and I'm also on LinkedIn, so if you'd like to join my network there. But please feel free to type some questions in the question box.
Okay, while we're waiting, I do have a quick poll. We'll just launch this very quickly and leave it on for maybe 30 seconds. But when was the last comprehensive review of your IBM I security versus best practices? And our choices are less than 6 months ago, 6 months to a year, 1 to 2 years, or what review? Be very interested, and we will publish these results when we're done. If you have questions, type them into the question box. Carol, you should be able to see those directly as they come in at this point.
Okay, yep. One of the questions was, if a developer, or actually anybody, doesn't own an object but public is all, would they still be able to save or store the object? And the answer is yes, they would be able to save or store the object. You just need existence to the object to be able to save it. That's that. Another question is, if a user profile exists on a system and a restore is done where the user profiles are being restored to, does the restore replace the entire profile or just the parameters that are different? And the answer to that is that it restores the entire profile. So including the password, by the way. So the password that was used when the save was performed will now be the password when the profile is restored. What is the performance hit when saving private authorities with the object? That's one of those it depends questions, but it goes out of band from saving the object. And when I say out of band, the system has to go to the object owner's user profile to gather up the private authorities that are associated with that object. So just saving the object is very fast because it's just grabbing that object. If the private authorities are being saved, it's got to go to the owner's user profile and do some gathering of the private authorities. So can't tell you the exact hit that you would see, but that's the cause of the performance ban, if you will. Let's see. Just sort of scrolling through these here. Okay, here's a question. Is there any way to determine how many private authorities are being saved if we want to reduce the SafeSec data time and research large numbers of private authorities? There's a command called, and let me get the right one. Print, well, let's flip over to an I-series system here, and let's just look at it this way. My favorite place, you all can now see my favorite place, which is Maui. And we'll get to a system. If you go I was about to go Sky PM, which is one of our products. Let's see, okay, print profile internals. So this command, not readily known, print profile internals, is a command that lists out how full a user profile is. Now, it used to be back in the earlier releases of user profiles that the user profile object could actually get full. So there were several limits on the earlier releases of IBM I back when it was AS400 for the size of that user profile. So when that happened, the profile couldn't own any more objects, or people couldn't be authorized to those objects anymore. So this command was really handy at that time to find out when a profile was about to be full. Right now, I use this command to find out where there are, if you will, pockets of large numbers of private authorities, or I look for it to see where end users are owning a large amount of objects. So we can just run this. Just get all of the user profiles. And so here is a list of all of the profiles on my system, and we have, this is one of our test systems, and we don't have very much on the system. So it's not going to register very much, but here is a percentage full. So this is the number of entries. It kind of reflects the number of those entries, the owned objects entries, the private authorities, and so forth. So here are the number of owned object entries. Here are the percentage, if you will, sorry, not number, of private authority entries. So if a user has been granted private authorities, that's what this column is. And this last column is the entries where the profile owns the object, but others have private authorities to it. And there's a fourth column, and that's for the primary group. So if we scroll down here to some of the system profiles, you'll see QSYS. Okay, so here's a better indication of this. So you can see that QSYS owns a bunch of objects, which is obviously the operating system, and there are users who have been given a private authority to objects that it owns. So if you think about this from an end user perspective, where I tend to look for those end users is in this column, the private authority column, and that's where you can start looking to reduce the number of private authorities for individuals. I also look for a large number of objects being owned by individuals rather than like by developers, if you will, on a production system versus the profile that's supposed to own the objects by design, if you will. So there you go. Let's see, just need to look through a couple other questions here, and then I think we'll be done here shortly. Sorry, just trying to scroll through here a minute. And there's a couple questions about encrypted backups, and those I'll have to defer off to Deb Sagan, or you'll have to ask somebody at IBM. I'm not a encrypted media backup person, especially when it comes to the tape, the various tape encryption folks. Can better answer that at IBM. So I think that that was it for the questions.
Okay. Well, let me share our results to our poll. Thank you very much. Virtually everyone participated, and you can see the group that you're in. This is something that If you are in a position where you would need a comprehensive review, this is exactly what Skyview does. Virtually everyone out there has some kind of requirement for regular vulnerability reviews, and I think it's obvious that an independent third-party review has many advantages over an internal review, and that's what Skyview does. One of the things we do with our risk assessor software and with our security checkup services. So if you do have questions, please let us know. And let me take this back for just 1 second. If you have any questions, you can contact us directly at skyviewpartners.com or certainly give us a call. That will be all for our session today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Carol, for a great presentation. Goodbye, everyone.